Greetings to the viewer and welcome back to yet another session of Vaktavya. This is the 10th episode of Vaktavya, and today it's my privilege that I am in conversation with writer and academic Ma'am Malashri Lal. Greetings, ma'am. Namaskar. Thank you for joining. It's really an honor for me to have a conversation with you, for which I was looking forward from a long time.
Great pleasure for me to be here, Uday. Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll begin the conversation. I would take you towards some of your memories. What are your memories or the things that are associated with your childhood?
Uday, I grew up in Rajasthan, mostly in Jaipur, but my family on both sides, my mother and my father, are from Bengal. So I grew up, in a sense, with a kind of a split background to my literary and cultural inheritance because there was a strong Bengali influence at home, which meant food, music, culture, dance, poetry, a great deal of reading of the classics. At the same time, in the world outside the home in Jaipur, it was not a Bengali environment at all. It was very much Rajasthan and Hindi speaking. And I went to a wonderful school which was English medium. It was the Maharani Gayatri Devi Girls Public School. It was then and even now continues to be a very highly regarded academic educational institution. So I grew up with sort of a Bengali ambience at home and a love for Bengali literature and culture and a love for Rajasthani literature, culture, Hindi literature, English literature, a very cosmopolitan world outside the home. So I had to find a certain kind of an identity within that bandwidth. Particularly on my father's side of the family, there was a direct link with Rabindranath Tagore because the family is from Shantiniketan. And my father's uncle was a very close associate of Rabindranath Tagore. This was Prabhat Kumar Mukherjee. And my mother's side was from Dehradun Bengalis and very much into music and sports. So I grew up, as I said, in my childhood with English, Hindi, Bengali, and some Sanskrit because I was interested in the subject.
Yes, ma'am. Talking about your literary life, why did you choose literature, women, and gender studies?
I think the answer follows from the discussion that we've just had about my split inheritance. And I'm going to read to you a poem that I wrote about it. That will also take us into why I chose to work with literature and gender. So, this poem is called Shamoli, Shyamoli, which was the name of the house that my parents had built and the home that we grew up in. Shamoli is also the name of the home where Tagore spent the last years of his life. And if anyone goes to Shantiniketan, it's a house made of mud. And he wrote a beautiful poem about the last years of his life that he looked forward to spending in Shamboli. So when my parents named the house Shamoli, I think in a way it positioned the duality that we were living with. And these are my short lines on this background. Tagore's shadow speckles the walls of this home, named for him. Today, I rebel and tug at a divided loyalty. The feudal heritage of my childhood fights off the reformist Bengali lineage. My troubled feminism struggling between poshak and parda, white than and patriotism. Can one push those ghosts aside? A tremulous, uncertain question rises in my parched throat. But a swab of new feminism throttles my voice, and I wonder whether silence and surrender is the best answer or a rebel's dying shriek of non belonging. So, why I say this background links with your query about why I turned to gender, culture, and such expressions. Um, it's because we have to understand where we come from. And I grew up with not only this environment, but if I were to shift to my university days in Rajasthan, like so many others of my generation, it was a very colonial British literature that we studied in the classroom. Very canonical. There was almost nothing Indian about it. So I started learning Sanskrit on the side and I started doing higher Hindi courses on the side. But in the classroom and for my degrees, it was very canonical English literature, British literature. So I decided I was going to try something new. And I started doing a specialization in American literature because I thought that was a new society, new community. Maybe their writing will have something to offer me. But in the American literature course also, there were mostly 19th century mainstream male writers, people like Mark Twain and Hawthorne and Herman Melville and Henry James. So I again got to a kind of a blockage there. Then it came to my PhD, and I said, okay, which one of these writes about women in almost all his works? And the answer was Henry James. So the tendency to move towards women's studies was there from childhood. But I found my footing only while I was doing my PhD. That too, when I had a Fulbright fellowship and I was in Harvard University, USA, working on Henry James's manuscripts in the library. But in the world outside that, in the campus, women's studies in America had come alive and was coming into a very vibrant kind of an existence, particularly with the African American writers, with the Caribbean writers. There were new voices. There was a sense of identity that women were asking for. There was Toni Morrison and her wonderful, powerful writing. Alice Walker talking about womanism and separating it from the canonical idea of feminism. And it engulfed me during my non PhD working hours. So once again, there was this dichotomy that I was living with, working on Henry James for a PhD and completely flooded happily with what I was hearing about women's studies. So when I completed my PhD on Henry James, and came back to India to continue my teaching at Delhi University. I taught Henry James for many, many, many years and enjoyed every moment of it because his expression and interest was in the lives of women. Particularly, I would mention the book, The Portrait of a Lady, which was in the prescribed syllabus. So, at the same time, then, I started working on women's issues, but I wanted to do it from a Indo-centric point of view. So that has been why I chose to link gender, culture, and women's studies.
Yes, ma'am. My next question would be on your writing process. Do you revisit your work and do you feel satisfied or do you feel there's something to be added that was not expressed?
That's always a tricky question to ask a writer, especially in my age, because I've been writing for decades now. So I have for you as an example the first book that I authored. It's called The Law of the Threshold: Women Writers in Indian English. So, this particular book came out of a fellowship that I had at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and was published in 1995. What I did here is I tried to move away from the Western definitions of feminism, which seemed to me very individualistic, very centered on the self, and if it moved out at all, it was to a nuclear family situation. And it was not particularly concerned with the larger community. The African Americans were somewhat different, but the theoretical premises of feminism that I was reading from not only America and England, but also from Europe, seemed to have a divide between the male and the female. It was a man versus woman kind of a framework within which the Western feminist thoughts were functioning. Take, for example, a book like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Already in the title, you have the oppositional man versus woman, and you already have the notion of sexuality and anatomy built into it. So the woman's body becomes a site of struggle, and already the assumption of a secondary status for the woman. Now, when I looked into the Indian background, I decided I was going to switch the gear and look at the history of feminism in India. We were always suspicious of that word, but nevertheless, you've got to give it some kind of a terminology. And for me, Sarojini Naidu would be a foremother for Indian feminism because Indian feminism, according to me, functions within the larger context of family and community. It is also not an oppositional aesthetics of man versus woman. And the figure for that understanding or mutuality, there can be opposition, there can also be a correlation, but I wanted to emphasize the correlation. And that is why I wrote this book, The Law of the Threshold. So you asked me about would I revisit it? I have revisited it, but I don't want to revise it because the premise of this book makes a woman's world in India a kind of a choice that she has to make between the private and the public world. Now, look at the authors I was examining, all the way from Toru Dutt to Bharti Mukherjee. And I based my analysis of these writers on the premise that if a woman rebels against the family structure and metaphorically speaking or realistically speaking leaves the threshold, jumps over the threshold, it is more or less a one way journey. It's very difficult to come back to that home and be domesticated once more, and that it is this struggle of having to make a difficult choice between the public and the private life that goes into a lot of strong writing by women in the language of English. I was not looking at other languages in this book. So I'm going to read a few lines which describes this premise and then go back to your question about revisiting. What I call the law of the threshold may serve as a methodological resource for feminist literary criticism in India. It denotes a strong sense of that which is inside and that which is out there. The threshold is a real as well as symbolic bar marking a critical transition. Men have traditionally passed over the threshold unchallenged and partaken of both worlds, the one within and the other without. Women have been expected to inhabit only the one world contained by the boundaries of home. So that was the premise of this book. Now, Uday, if I were to revisit it, the definition of public versus private has changed. The newer generation is certainly making many, many transitions going back and forth. It's a more equitable life. But these are writers who came after Bharti Mukherjee. There were exceptions even before that, but they were not in my story. I can't expand this book, I can't revise it because I cannot go back and redefine the premise on which this book is based.
Such a beautiful book it is. When I was reading it, the beautiful introduction that you have written and the beautiful collection of writings that you have chosen. And now moving, you have very intensively written on and lectured on women socio and cultural positioning. What changes do you see in socio cultural status of women? Are they satisfactory?
The socio-cultural context of women will keep changing. And satisfaction is a word which has a full stop after it. I don't think one can ever do that. There's always more to be done. So the vision is not towards satisfaction, the vision is towards equality. And equality doesn't mean being identical. There will always be a difference among men and women, and there is plenty of other differences that are layered within the Indian social polity. And I think most of all, we have to keep in mind that we live in a very complex social environment today. There are always interlinkages that we should be aware of. A woman belongs not just to her own self definition, but she's part of a family, community, caste, religion, subset. And it is not a single identity either. It keeps shifting, it keeps moving. So, a woman or a man for that matter in India has multiple identities, and these function in a simultaneous kind of a way. So, when we talk about socio-cultural change, we have to be aware of the layering of Indian society. So, while there is advancement at one level, for instance, there are many, many more women and girl children going into school than have done before. There are many more women in the workforce today at certain levels than ever before. But does it mean that it's a more equitable life for women when it comes to decision making? My answer would be no. Because even if there are more women in the workforce, more women in education, more women earning a livelihood, how many of them have control over the money that they use? How many of them have decision making powers which they control and the others will listen to them? So that would be my overall question to you and to others who are talking about how much equality is there now? Are things better? My answer is yes, things are definitely better, but there is a long way to go.
Surely, ma'am. Rather than reinforcing conventional boundaries, it is necessary to stretch them to comprehend the new shapes and contours of human identity. What explains your interest in mythology?
Exactly what you're saying. We've got to extend the boundaries. So each writer, each individual will try to find areas in which he or she believes she can contribute towards a meaningful expansion. So, in this case, Namita Gokhale and I decided to write on Indian mythology, and our first book is called In Search of Sita. Here it is, this book. It's a book that I'm very, very fond of because we started work on this way back in 2006, and not too much was being said at that time about revisiting mythology. But when we started looking at the common idea that people had then about Sita, it's changed now, that she was submissive, she was quiet, that decisions were made for her, that she was actually under the protection of the royal forces around her and of her husband, and also the other people who were in great support of her. That she was, in a way, an individual who was guided by others. But when we looked into the original sources of the Ramayana, and this is by now quite well known, that Valmiki and Tulsi Ramayana are only two among very many other variations of the Ramayana. When we started looking at the folk Ramayana, the Ramayana narratives from southern India, in the smaller traditions of northern India, into the hill regions, we found that there is the total picture of Sita is that of a very strong woman. And why I say this, and this comes out very much in our book because that was the vision of the book, to show her to be a decisive, strong, self determined, a greatly dignified, and highly respected woman. It comes out in many parts of the story. For instance, we all know about the period that Sita is said to have spent under the control and power of Ravan. in Ashok Vatika. And all the Ramayans tell us that Ravan never had the ability or the power to come anywhere close to Sita. Here was a single woman without the so called traditional support around her, but she did extremely well in keeping herself protected from any kind of assault whatsoever. Now, this is a signification of Sita's strength, but there are other instances also. I'm going to read out a few lines from the book, from a conversation that Namita Gokhale and I had, which has also been printed here. So I'm reading out a few lines from my section in this dialogue. Sita has a quiet determination and a resolute mind, even as a young wife in the hierarchical family headed by Raja Dashrath. Note that when Rama wishes to proceed on exile alone, Sita asserts herself by insisting on accompanying him. She wishes to give away her fine jewels and clothing, and she would like to assume the appearance of an ascetic in keeping with the new status of Ram. The two brothers leave for the forest accompanied by the determined Sita. This is a pattern in many mythologies. The 14 years of Vanvas or forest exile are paralleled in the wanderings of the hero in tales around the world. The contrasting theme of a corrupt state and the innocence of nature is foregrounded. But of course, the pastoral idyll is rudely interrupted, setting the premise for the war between the forces of good and evil. So, Uday, that's the kind of framework within which the work I did, Namita and I did on Sita comes through and partially answers your question about expanding the horizons of conventional boundaries. If there's time, we will talk about the book on Radha.
Yes, surely. These are the beautiful anthologies. Talking more about these books, your different books, your book and anthology interpreting homes in South Asian literature is unique in its focus on literary narratives of home. How did the idea for this book came to you? How did the idea happen to you?
Yes, let me look for the book. Here it is. So, you're entirely right in saying that it's an important book from the viewpoint that home is very basic to our self identification, no matter who we are, what gender, which part of the world, what age. So, this is a book which looks into the many interpretations of home. One of the best reviews of the book was written by Subhash Chandra, who teaches at Delhi University. And he correctly said that the book deals with three broad notions of home. One is the condition of homelessness. Second is how do we construct the idea of home. And third, what home means to different categories of people. It's very insightful because if you look at somebody like Salman Rushdie, his book is called Imaginary Homelands. Now, that comes from a perspective of a great writer for whom the movement from South Asia to England and thereafter living there and writing about India, especially Midnight's Children, which was an absolutely path breaking novel. It is a story of how you imagine a homeland, and he uses the magic realistic method of talking about homes. On the other hand, if you talk about constructed homes, I would guide you towards the diaspora writers. There is Jhumpa Lahiri, there is, well, of course, Bharti Mukherjee, now there's Chitra Divakaruni Banerjee. So many of them are talking about the relocation. And the relocation should not be done as an outsider, but in a sense, you carry your home inside you. That home within is a home that is made of values and culture. The physical structure may be different. Now, then, if you're looking at the different categories of people, Interpreting Homes is a book that I co edited with my friend Sukrita Paul Kumar. And it's very closely tied to the visits that Sukrita and I would make to the shelters for the homeless in the terrible winters of Delhi. We would go at 10 o'clock at night. We always had police escorts and social workers who went with us. But our idea was to talk to the people, give them some solace. They were away from whatever be their home. Here they were in a tent provided by the government. They were provided food, blankets, but at the same time, these are bone chilling winters, and one needs spiritual and poetical and cultural solace. And sometimes there would be music, sometimes there would be storytelling, invariably there would be meditation. And some of the people, many of them were rickshaw pullers, they were illiterate, and they would ask us and our volunteers कि घर पे चिट्ठी लिख दो. So their idea of home was elsewhere, not this tent. Ghar pe chitti likh do, and then the volunteers would pen down a few lines on a postcard in those days. So that is why the book Interpreting Homes, I'm glad you picked on it, is a very important one because it brings together my life and work as an academic and my life and work as a social work volunteer.
Yes, certainly, ma'am. Talking on your book, Tagore and the Feminine, A Journey in Translations, is an attempt to understand Tagore's engagement with feminine from the perspective of the contemporary reader. How do you see, in your perspective, feminine in Tagore's writing?
Yes, that's an interesting question. The book came out of the period when I was a senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture, and the government of India was celebrating a very significant year in Tagore's legacy. There were conferences being held all over the world that were guided by the External Affairs Ministry and the Cultural Ministry. And a whole team of us were working on that. During this period of intense research into Tagore and meeting many Tagore scholars, I realized that in my eyes, Tagore's work on the feminine as a concept, as protagonists, as storytelling components had actually not been put together as a book. So I decided to go ahead and do it. So, in a nutshell, the book shows, and this is true of others also who have read Tagore, he was a very progressive thinker and a very progressive writer. His ideal was equality between men and women, equal opportunity for women and men. And he created that wonderful university of Bishwa Bharati, calling it the world in a nest. That is the motto of the university, because he believed there should be no discrimination, neither by gender nor by caste or class. So the ideal that he had gets transmitted through his poetry, through his songs, his stories, his novels. And it's a very vast subject, so let's bring it down to one or two points. Tagore has written on the Ardhanarishwar using this old Hindu icon of half woman and half man, Shiva and Shakti, to represent the holistic manner in which human society can best prosper. And his own stories and novels look at a novel like The Home and the World, which is also a story which fits into my idea of the threshold, because that is the story of a man who encourages his wife to become politically aware, to be active in politics, to be educated, to go out into the world, to leave the Antar Mahal and go out. When she goes out of the home, she falls prey to manipulative forces and almost gets tempted to break up that home. But things happen and she realizes her errors. But the husband tells her that actually, if you don't go out into the world, you don't know what your errors can be. and is perfectly all right. So, the idea of the home and the world being a simultaneous existence is what was Tagore's idea. There's another very well known short story in the syllabi of many universities, which is called The Wife's Letter. And in that epistolary form, the wife tells the husband that I'm leaving your home because you're too authoritarian, too uncaring. You don't see me as an individual, you don't see the other women in the household as individuals. You just see us as tropes in your existence, and therefore I'm leaving. A third novel, which has become a famous film, Chokhir Bali, is about widowhood. Now, that is a novel which shows you how widows were, uh, in a way, misunderstood in their time, ill treated by society. But by bringing the widow to the center of the story and showing her to be a vulnerable figure, yet with a supreme intelligence of her own, Tagore brings dignity to the woman, no matter where he places her. And that is why I decided to write the book Tagore and the Feminine.
Yes. I would request you if you can read some of the parts of the book if you could.
Okay.
It's a beautiful book and beautifully written. The introduction, how you explains the Tagore and talking about the
Uh,
Ardhanarishwar story and
yes, I could do that. So, one of the things that, and this will interest young people today, because there's so much talk about transgendering, cross dressing. So, Tagore also had an androgynous imagination, and he used mythology to revisit it. I'm reading a few lines from here. Tagore entered the realms of the mythical to find icons for his androgynous imagination. The idea of a companionate romance was dear to Tagore's heart, and his dance drama Chitrangada, 1892, was based upon this value. The original episode in the Mahabharata is altered in many details. Rabindranath embroiders the story to make Chitra, as the heroine is called in the 1913 English transcreation by Tagore himself. Chitra is a dual character, a warrior, man like person whom Arjun rejects, and the luscious beauty with whom he falls madly in love. He named the two sides of Chitrangada as Kurupa or ugly and Shurupa or beautiful, leading to much criticism in feminist circles and problems of performance on stage. Chitrangada prays to Madan, the god of love, to make her this alluring beauty. Tagore used the Shurupa image as a device for educating Arjuna in higher values. Chitrangada's composite identity as the strong warrior and the seductive beauty contains the male as well as the female and teaches a lesson to the archetypical male Arjun that a true partnership is above biological difference or socially constructed roles. So that's from my introduction.
beautiful, ma'am, beautiful. A vehement question that always that coming to my mind after listening you're talking that how linguistic ideology and multicultural because you were learning many languages, you were from Bangla and also your childhood came in Rajasthan, helped you in literature.
See, this is a very important aspect of literature, gender, and cultural studies in India today because we are a very multilingual nation. Any Indian is likely to be able to manage three languages. And I'm not even talking of the highly educated Indians. I'm talking of even ordinary Indians who are not highly educated and are doing ordinary but necessary tasks in life. And your Anantamurthy had some very interesting vocabulary that he used for that. He used to call one the house language, the another the upstairs language, and the third is the street language. So one is so what he meant was that we use a certain kind of a colloquialism, mixed language. Then there's a purist language, and there is the everyday language, which can again be of a different kind or a different language altogether. So not only is it the formality of different languages, but within each language there are different registers that one uses, from formal to the colloquial. Now, where this has happened to our advantage is the literary growth in contemporary India. The literature in regional language has always been very rich and very vast. But there were some languages that dominated over other in people's cultural thinking. For instance, people always believed that Bengali literature was very old and very vast. So was Tamil literature, and so was Malayali literature. Now, what has happened now with people opening into other areas, we're discovering a wealth of literature from Kashmir, from Odisha, from Jharkhand, from Bihar. So, actually, the truth is that we didn't have access to all these languages till the digital world, in a way, took over and translation became an important activity. Now that we are reading and listening and discussing languages across India, 22 official languages that Sahitya Academy recognizes, plus Sanskrit and English, so 24 languages. And there are government policies which encourage and support interlinguistic translation, inter-regional work. All this has led to a very vibrant and vast corpus of material that is now available to us in multiple languages. So I would urge all the young listeners to take advantage of this wonderful situation in India where regional language and English is at par, and let us celebrate this multiplicity, and let us hone whatever language skills that we have and participate in the act of translation and discussion between and amongst languages.
Yes. As time allows us, you were talking about Sita. So you said that if time allows, you will talk about something about Radha. So it's a very beautiful anthology. If you could speak a little about that.
Yes, I'm happy to speak about our book, Namita and Gokhale, and I did this book called Finding Radha. What is significant about Radha is that she is an imaginary character. Whereas Krishna's life has a very long trajectory. We know of how he was born, we know of the period that he spent in Vrindavan, that is the period in which Radha appears in his life, and then the Mahabharata, the Gita, and then the end of the war, and then Krishna passing on, the death of Krishna. We know this trajectory. As compared to that, we only know of Radha through her romantic attachment to Krishna, the Vrindavan years. We don't know about Radha's childhood. We don't know what happened to Radha post the time that Krishna left for Dwarka. So, Namita and I had this question: what does Radha mean? And as we opened up that question and did our research, brought other people into the anthology, Radha means to each of us whatever we want her to mean, because she stands for unconditional love. And for each of us, that is a very high value, unconditional love. So, whether it is towards a friend, a parent, a lover, a spouse, a child, it is the capacity to always give that love that Radha represents. Now, when we come to the literary part of it, Radha Krishna's romance became absolutely famous and got repeatedly reenacted, recreated because of the 12th century writer Jayadev, and the book, of course, is called the Geet Govind. But Radha exists in history long before that, 7,000 years before that. So the point of our book is that she's a perennial figure because she captures the modern imagination and also captured the ancient imagination. We have contemporary works by Dharamveer Bharti, for instance. by lots of other writers who are Ramakant Rath, who are talking about the image of Radha. And I think her magic lies in that idea of unconditional love.
Yes. So if you could, I would request you if you could read something from the book.
Oh, I'm not sure I have the book. Let me look for it.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. So there is a beautiful section which was we were able to put together, which is called the Songs of Radha, and I'm going to read something from there because people don't know that the first appearance of Radha by name happens through a woman poet of the 7th century. And this poem we found with great difficulty, and we were able to get a translation. And for that, I have to thank all the people who helped us. It's a short poem, originally in Sanskrit. I'm reading the English version. And what of those abors of vines that grow where the river drops away from Kalindi mountain? They conspired in the love games of herding girls and watched over the veiled affairs of Radha. Now that the days are gone, when I cut their tendrils and laid them down for couches of love, I wonder if they've grown brittle and, and if their splendid blue flowers have dried up. So that's a 7th century poem. If I were to look at the other side of the narration, the most recent one that we have is Dharamveer Bharti. This is translated from the Hindi by Alok Bhalla. Dharamveer Bharti he's no more, but he's really our contemporary. I'll read just a few lines from the translation. Under the mango tree, you stood under this mango tree and called to me. Even now, when I come here, I find peace. No, I think of nothing, recall nothing at all. Words, meaningless. But, Kanu, how will you explain to me the meaning of all this? Words, 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 for me they are meaningless. If I don't hear them from your trembling lips when you sit by me, your fingers entangled in my dry hair, they're meaningless. Words, words, words. Karma, swadharma, judgment, obligation. I've heard these words in every lane. Arjuna may have found in them something of value, but my love, when I hear them, I understand nothing.
Certainly a beautiful narration, ma'am. And
Thank
now
you.
I would end this conversation by two questions. And if time allows, I would request you to read something from one of your favorite writings from your book only, if time allows, after the two questions.
Yeah.
So I would ask that collectively now, as an academic, as a writer, how do you see collectively your life till now?
I see my life primarily as a teacher and as a person who believes one has to work towards positive social change for women. I have done my little contribution wherever I could in the university, along with being professor of English in the department. I was also the director of women's studies for many years. And I've always believed that literature can't be kept only within the classroom. It has to be applicable at ground level reality. So, literature has to be related to life. And it has been my endeavor as a teacher to ensure that the link is made. Second, I see myself as a mentor because I do believe that it's a two-way process. The mentor not only gives but also receives. And in my many years, my students and I have had wonderful conversations. Many of them have become very good friends. Some have become co authors because mentorship is not a permanent idea. You know, the idea of mentorship is that you teach what you can, but the other person may learn so much that you need some help on your side. So, but a mentorship is important for young people because the value of experience is to be passed on. And believe me, it's a two-way process. The mentor also gains a great deal from that conversation with the mentees.
Yes, ma'am.
And now, when you're talking about the collective of my life, I do believe that these two sides of me has come together because I spend a lot of my time writing and also doing volunteer work for social welfare organizations for women, particularly for women and for children. So that keeps me, in a sense, not only busy but very mentally and in a academic sense occupied.
Yes. Today, our youth is far from reading, and children of my age are not more inclined towards literature. What will be your message to the children of my age?
First, I will disagree with your statement that young people are not reading. I think by reading, if you mean printed pages of a book, then it's a very limited definition of reading. Young people are reading more than ever before because reading is basically being interested in a narrative, in storytelling. And there is so much of it available in the digital world that they are reading. They're reading ebooks, they're looking at films on the screen, reading at news stories, they're reading other people's blogs, they're writing blogs, they're reading. What we're doing right now is also reading a screen. So, according to me, reading is a much larger definition. And since we are in a digital world, we have to understand that reading means digital reading. And young people, more than anyone else, is venturing into that. Second, the multiplying literature festivals all around the country certainly shows the love of books, both reading, writing, listening, discussing. It is a world of books. So books have become a lifestyle statement and no harm there. In fact, I think it's for the good. So books are very much there. So I would urge that we have a broader definition of reading than what appears on a printed page. So
Yes.
my message would be keep reading and keep telling your stories and reading other people's stories. That is the act of reading life, and that's important.
Yes, ma'am. Now the time allows, and we would like to end this conversation by your reading from your any book of yours. And yes, we would end the conversation by that.
All right. So I'm going to end this conversation by reading a few lines from this book called Speaking for Myself. This is a book of Asian women's writing and the first of its kind. So far, we've been talking about Western feminism and what it means, a different kind of an Indo-centric approach. So it's a good idea for me to enlarge this in the last few minutes of the conversation to talk about women in Asia. So this book came out of a project where we got in touch with 34 countries in Asia and almost 80 contributors in this book. It was the first time that so many women writers from around Asia were brought under the cover of a book, and we had discussions. Why did we do this? Because we felt that, like India, other Asian countries would also have their notion of feminism, their women's equality, and it's culturally coded, it's historically directed. So we wanted to know what contemporary women in Asia felt about themselves, what were their hopes and their desires, what was their notion of equality. So I'm reading from the introduction that Sukrita Paul Kumar and I wrote for this book. This collection of stories and poems has a deliberate eclecticism about it. The stories and poems are neither representative pieces vis a vis their countries nor of their writers. There is no dominating viewpoint of the editors. Mainly accessible and aesthetic appeal have governed our preferences, and if we may add, in general, What we modestly offer in this book is a pose of women's writing that insists on the dignity of Asian women, shown by the sheer strength of women's identities lived in a variety of roles, with many of them breaking the stereotype and seeking to come into their own. So that's the final word, that women everywhere in Asia and everywhere in the world, I think, are wanting to break the stereotype and to live with dignity.
Beautiful narration with a beautiful meaning, I would say. A very significant reading, I would say, in the contemporary times. And thank you so much, ma'am. I would really thank you for such a thought provoking conversation. From your busy schedule, you given us the time, and we had such a lovely conversation.
Thank you very much, Uday. I have enjoyed being in the conversation, and your questions were very perceptive. And thank you for the opportunity for me to elaborate my thoughts and comments and to relate to a young audience that you have. I wish
Thank
you
you
the
so
very
much.
best, and also your school, your classmates, all the young people who are listening to the program. My best wishes always with you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a delightful experience to be in conversation with you.